لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. These arkan, or these four pillars of spiritual knowledge, or of realizing through working with these four pillars of ma'rifah, of having an intimate knowledge, intimate intuitive knowledge of self, of God, of the world, and of the tendencies in the self that take us away from God and ourselves, is important to understand that it's a process and a continuous process of as it were, contemplating, experiencing, even tasting experientially these pillars. The more we taste them, the more we are opened by God to a particular spiritual state and knowledge and attitude that arises upon the heart to help us perceive the real nature of reality, as it is in regards to the reality of God, or the nature of God, the reality of the world, or the nature of the world, the reality of the satanic tendency, or the infernal tendencies, the tendencies to be succumbed by our lower desires and self, and the tendency to live by the self-identity of the ego self. All of these are insights, intuitions, and tastings, adawak, spiritually, that occur when we are practicing, contemplating, tasting, and realizing these four pillars. So this cannot be stressed, enough. One cannot just do a 10-minute, in other words, a 10-minute guided meditation on stillness, or on being still, and awaken to the real meaning of stillness and what that means in regards to your spiritual reality, that actually you are stillness. You're the stillness that you're seeking by being still, until you realize this. Being still, or practicing being still, is very important. And you're tasting the activity of practicing being still, which is another way of saying of isolating yourself, right? And this whole process that occurs until we awaken to an innate stillness, an inner inherent stillness that's always there, even in our movement, and that this then causes a shift in perception of self-awareness of what we are, who we are. That if we are the stillness, that which we have tasted throughout the days in itikaf and spiritual retreat, if we really are this existential quality of stillness, then what does that mean in regards to how I can understand when my mind is moving so much, is in so much movement, and is agitated? What does this gives me a means to be able to take a look at that and see that movement, that chaos, that energetic, that overwhelm, is actually not me. I, this stillness, am being overwhelmed by this chaotic movement, this agitation. It gives me, in other words, an opportunity to inquire into the nature of these things, right? A kind of ma'rifatun nafs, ma'rifah of the world, ma'rifah of God, ma'rifah of shaitan, of how shaitan, how Satan can use these tendencies to distract us further, or to make us feel a despair that we get sucked into, trapped into energetically. But by tasting these four contemplative spiritual qualities, these pillars of spiritual knowledge in retreat, we begin to have the proper contemplative tools for spiritual transformation. That's the point. This cannot be, kind of emphasized enough. I will continue saying this. And often it's a process of practicing, for example, the activity of being still, until we're still enough and gathered enough in our mind that we awaken to the stillness of the heart, the spiritual heart, right? So, isolating ourselves so that we are isolated from everything, freed from from everything and every preoccupation except God. and thereby we awaken being isolated with God or secluded with God in our heart. That was the whole point. And this evokes a sense of stillness that is a quality of the spiritual heart. Stillness of self, stillness of the ever-present the ever-present presence of God that is immutable and always still and present in you. Contemplating that and striving to live from that, that awareness, that awakened awareness and presence, right? And the table, as we already mentioned, the more we practice this in some way, shape, or form, and that's what I'm going to get into for tonight's talk. Practicing, for example, seclusion or uzla or stillness in some way, shape, or form will procure in some way, for the sake of God, certain spiritual states or insights or experiences, which then, when seen enough, becomes a decisive intuition in self-awareness, in the perception of the heart regarding the knowledge of the reality of the self, knowledge of the reality of God, the knowledge of the actual reality of the world, and the knowledge of the actual weakness of the shaitan, who parades as a bully and takes us astray, but is actually very weak when his fuel is cut off, food and drink, in regards to the body and mind. Right? Contemplating these things then shows or to reveals the illusions for what they are. Allahumma arinal ashya kama hiya, a famous, well-known prayer of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that, oh God, show me things as they are. This asking of God to show you things as they are is only possible. It is only possible for you to see them as they are by God, from God. It's only possible for you to see that God is showing you certain things as they are when you're in isolation enough, when you're in seclusion enough, when you're still enough, when you're silent enough, when you're empty enough from the hunger, and when you're awake enough from the wakefulness. Then you begin seeing. Then you begin having intuitive awareness of the reality of these things. Right? Sometimes almost every time we have to slow down to then understand something or to figure something out. Right? And so, with that said, because the natural progression of practicing or contemplating these spiritual pillars starts as an activity or practice, then may open to a state of being, and then may open to a spiritual knowledge, which is the goal. Various practices in Islamic spirituality in the context of a spiritual retreat can be helpful in working with these pillars in ways that you may not have realized, but it's just happening naturally. So we're going to get into that. Inshallah, that's my intention for today. So in this regard, um, uh, I want to bring our attention to certain practices of presence that I call practices of presence, that some of you who may have taken courses I've done over the years, and the very few courses I have online, either with Al-Balagh or Al-Karam Institute, and inshallah moving forward with Hudur Institute, that we will do in primarily courses on Islamic meditation that I will be calling the practice of presence in Islamic spirituality. And inshallah, we'll be writing some kind of book on this as well, as a companion book to courses like this, inshallah. These practices of presence in Islamic spirituality are pretty much delineate meditation, prayer, contemplation, and the practice of virtue, of contemplative spiritual virtues in various ways. And these actually have real names in Islamic spirituality. And I'm going to list them. And if I'll try to do some exercises, or simply the exercise will be to ask you something, so the insight is made aware. And this will then connect it to the pillars. And then inshallah, the intention will be to have the time to maybe do a 2-minute exercise, which will be very fast, but to try to taste what I'm talking about for even those who are online, inshallah. Those who are here have already tasted all the pillars here in some way, shape, or form to some degree for some sustained amount of time, obviously. And the goal, you could say, and the quality of all these pillars, they're really pointers to, or they effectively bring you into the spiritual heart, into an opened heart. Because when you experience stillness, you must be in your heart spiritually. You can think about stillness, but when you're still enough, when you're practicing being still, at some point, if you're not trying to do anything or trying to gain something, you may awaken to a sense of something that is still, that is the stillness. You move from practicing being still to an awakened sense of stillness. That sense is a spiritual intuition which points to the nature of your spiritual heart that now you've entered, because your heart is the stillness. And if we learn to rest there after we've discovered it, we can learn to live from there. That's the whole point. Right? So these practices, in essence, are the first, I would say, is in muhasabah, the practice of muhasabah, which you all may have heard of. Another practice, and remember, they fall into this category of meditation, prayer, contemplation, and virtue. These four. But the first is muhasabah. The second is muraqabah. The third is fikr. The fourth is dhikr. Right, and if we and then so these are the overlying, the foundational kind of spiritual practices of presence, or the practices of presence, of evoking or working with meditative presence in Islamic spirituality. What is muhasabah? Muhasabah is, very simply put, examining oneself in whichever way or shape or form that we do, but for the sake of God and for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of our akhirah, or for the sake of a happy return on the day of judgment. A well-known saying is to take account before you are taken account of, which really sums up what the purpose of muhasabah is. We should take account of ourselves, meaning the actions we have put forth in a lifetime, and starting with our day, perhaps in the night. And we should take account and see what we have put forth in our actions, see what we've done. And to first and foremost take account of this, almost like taking self, inventory. What has come in and what has gone out? Just take account of this. This is really what muhasabah is, and there's many modalities of it in Islamic spirituality. There is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ who mentioned that there was a companion, who is a person of paradise, and the companions, the most, and this is a companion that was not well known by the other companions, who were very near the Prophet ﷺ, and so they began asking each other, what does he do that we don't, and that the Prophet ﷺ singled him out and said that he is indeed a man of paradise. So they began observing him. So interesting enough, they performed a muhasabah of him, right? So they began observing him, and they found, and then to the point, which just seems like a move that Sidi Haidar would do or something. I'm like knocked on his door, like, hey, do you mind if I stay with you for a little bit? No reason whatsoever, just kind of random, right? And this man was very nice enough, and he allowed the companion in. I'm sure he said, for the sake of God or something like this, right? And for the sake of God, if you don't mind me staying with you, and being with you for a day or two. And then so he observed him again, without mentioning he was observing him, right? And he came to the conclusion that there was nothing he did that the companion didn't do himself. And so finally, this became the state of a few of the companions who were observing this man. And so they asked him directly. They were now quite frustrated, in a good way. They're just more not frustrated, but perplexed. Why did the Prophet ﷺ call this man or single him? out for paradise. And so then they asked, yeah, so and so, radiallahu an, um, the Prophet ﷺ praised you and said that you are among the people of paradise. He was very shocked when he heard this, in his humility. And then they asked, is there anything that you do? We have now observed you, um, for the sake of learning what God gave you that we do not have, so that we can strive to be among those of paradise. So then they asked him again, what is it that perhaps you do that we do not know or we do not see? So he began thinking about this. In other words, he began performing a muhasabah himself. And then he came to a conclusion. Well, you saw everything, but right before I went to sleep, I made a prayer. And the other companions, probably, imagined, oh, I pray at night too, right before I sleep, making maybe a personal to supplication to before I sleep. And he said that I had harassed God in private, in the unseen, inwardly, and I see if there was anyone who has hurt me in my life, from the present moment or from before, in my life, in my past until the present moment. If there's anyone who has hurt me, I forgive them to before God, and I ask God to bear witness that I've forgiven them. So meaning I've let go of this hurt and this pain, and I've forgiven them for it, for the sake of God. And so I ask God to bear witness. Then I fall asleep. I bring this example up, of course, then they realized why. He was a man of paradise. He was a person, a soul of paradise. And it's a very beautiful hadith. One can find this in various texts. You can find this in Imam al-Ghazali, in some of his texts, his works, maybe one on the Muhasabah and Muraqabah, actually, which we'll get to in a moment. And one can see here that this companion, and so same with the other companions, they observed this other person. And then finally, when he was confronted of this matter, he observed himself and he realized, perhaps it's this thing that I do. What I want to bring to your attention is another third wall here, that actually this prayer he performed and asked God to bear witness, this is also a kind of muhasabah scan. This is a muhasabah he did, not just seeing what might be the act that makes him someone special. But there's one thing you guys didn't catch, ya companions, and that is that I do this. Perhaps that's what it is. And what that is before he sleeps, he would take a look at his day and see if there was any ill will he had in his heart that still remained. And he asked God to accept it and release it and be absolved from it by forgiving them, by having God bear witness that he has actually forgiven them, because he actually has. That's a lot of inner work. That's a lot of inner work. And that's an example of muhasabah, right? This man, he took hisab of himself. He took account of himself. He observed himself and saw, and the thing he was looking at here in particular was a sense of ill will in the heart. Am I hurt by someone? Have I hurt someone, or am I hurt? Is there something in my heart that is broken and hurt? And then he would give that unto God. And he would ask God to bear witness that verily I have actually forgiven them. I've let this go. How many of us are capable of that? Especially with those who have really hurt us. This is a question that we should ask. It takes us a whole lifetime, often, to process the pain and the abuse and the trauma that comes for some of us, in regards to how much we've been hurt by someone. So how difficult is it to actually really forgive them and to let it go so that you are not suffering? That person is not, most likely, meaning probably they don't even know, or they could care less that they had hurt you. You all know what I'm talking about. There's so many examples in anyone's life, right? But you have been hurt by this, devastated by it. and it has changed your self to perception and life as you move forward. The ability to actually acknowledge that and actually forgive them, because according to Muslim belief and iman, we will face our Lord, and this conflict between two individual souls will be the veil that holds them back from paradise. God can forgive, and he will, and you will have a hisab in your muhasabah. God will perform a muhasabah upon you on the day of judgment. Take account before you're taken account of. That's from God or by God, right? It is very possible and very easy that God will be generous with your imperfections. But according to Islamic teachings, what we have caused in terms of hurt to others or those who have hurt us, this will take, in all due fairness, a counsel with God, a consultation with God when we confront each other about this, that you are the reason for this. I've been hurt and this changed the course of my life. You need to know that you hurt me like this. This will be presented when we say it to the person and in front of God, and God will be the ultimate judge. Now, in Islamic teachings, if in this situation you are absolutely that you are actually correct in the matter of the confrontation between two hearts, the conflict between two hearts, God will then ask you after he proclaims what is right here, what is justice, and he will ask you, you can forgive them or take what you need to take from them of their deeds to help your state. And in Islamic teachings, if you forgive them, then God forgives you, actually. And so imagine if you do this now, not only does it help your akhirah, it helps your world, your dunya, your present moment life, because you're letting go of all of that stuck and pent up energy and pain and wound that's affecting you and not even the other person who's not even aware and might be shocked on the day of judgment when they hear it, right? That this is how you affected them, right? And then God will decide between the both of you, and there'll naturally, I'm sure, will be a lot of give and takes until it comes to a head, and then a decision is made. Even at that point, one can forgive, and that is better for us. But we may not be in a state to completely forgive, but this would be better for us. So if we can do this now, it is much better for us, not only in the next life, in the akhirah, in our meeting with God, but actually in this life, in this present moment. So this is very important. This is an example of muhasabah in the early tradition, right? This is why I gave this prolonged story to make this point. In this whole story, since I gave the story of this hadith, when the companions were observing that companion, if you can imagine that you're observing someone or something, what needs to be done? What are the prerequisites of you to be able to observe? When you're looking at something carefully, what's the existential backdrop? What's going on? Does anyone know what I'm trying to hit at here? In order to observe, what must you be at that moment?
Still.
You must be present. You must be open. You must be still.
Silent.
Still and silent. So I wanted and I want to hone in on, so all of you are right, but I'm going to emphasize stillness. When we're still, we are more present and open to observe. So the quality of stillness procures observation, self-observation, contemplative observation, not just even physical observation. You can imagine a man with binoculars or someone observing, right, or whatever it is, right? You're still, you're physically still, but when you're observing yourself and even imagining or visualizing the day that you've had and all the actions until the present moment, you've cultivated some kind of stillness to be able to do that. And if you go beyond your actions, and of course, at the end of this, if you find what is good in your actions, you thank Allah for it. And if you find something that is not so good, you ask for forgiveness for it and for both you thank Allah for the opportunity of being able to perform this kind of scan, this contemplative scan, right? Now, in that whole process, you are most usually in a place of stillness, at least inwardly, if not outwardly, you're still. So you see how you're cultivating a kind of, you've isolated yourself, you've secluded yourself in that moment. You are not being bothered or encumbered by your thoughts about other things or other physical worries or activities. And in that moment, for those few moments, you are still and observing what you did until the present moment. That is cultivating stillness. So the backdrop of that is stillness, right? So in other words, when we practice muhasabah, if we are still enough inwardly, we can begin naturally observing from the intellect of the mind, mindful observing, mindful sensing. How does all this happen? There needs to be enough of a sense of cultivated stillness to be able to mindfully sense. You could not just mindfully sense, even in contemporary mindfulness practices, to without cultivating enough stillness to be able to then understand what sensing is. Sensing of the breath. Take a breath in and out. Follow the sensations of the breath from the in breath into the nostrils and holding it, and the sensations of the expansion of the chest, then of the letting go of the breath, the contraction and the exhalation. All of this sensing implies a sense of cultivated stillness to be able to do the sensing. That sensing is a kind of subtle observing, self-observation. Self-observation. We return to muhasabah. Its backdrop, its context contemplatively is a sense of stillness. When we are stillness, when we are the stillness, we naturally begin observing in a subtle way, also in a very explicit way, but I mean contemplatively in a subtle way. We're observing ourself, how we are reacting when someone's speaking, how we are reacting when we are speaking, what we are saying. When we're more present, we come into a natural state of contemplative observation, contemplative observing. This is a mode of muhasabah, of a present moment muhasabah, rather than a retrospective one that I just mentioned, with the past coming to the present of our actions. Or if you go beyond that to how you've been feeling, scanning your emotions to the present, or what kind of thoughts you've had. Some of these practices are important and helpful, especially if we have some kind of vice or like some kind of addiction, to be able to observe patterns and to just see them through, see them clearly. That's a mode of self-observation. That is muhasabah. That implies contemplative stillness, which is connected to seclusion or uzla. So you see how this is working, right? In other words, the more you are in a state of seclusion, the more still you become inwardly, even if you're moving around. And the more still you are, the more available you are for mindful and spiritual contemplative observations of the body in terms of sensing, of the mind in terms of thinking, and of the emotional heart in terms of feelings, and so forth. Right? I hope that makes sense. And in this can be, as mentioned, the subtle faculties that work here are the mindful intellect that has been activated and is observing the nafs and the movements of the nafs, right? Or the sensations of the body, how we're feeling in our body when we're upset, or to whatever is the practice that you're doing. All of these can be integrated into Islamic practice, as Islamic practice is a presence in the mode of muhasabah, which is um, of which the contemplative context is that of practicing stillness or being still enough. Then we have muraqabah, and before I go to muraqabah, we can say that although stillness is the more dominant quality here, we can bring in silence, that one, because stillness, as we deepen in stillness, we awaken to a sense of silence. If you're still enough, you're going to notice the silence rather than simply observing. Excuse me, rather than simply observing, which is also a very subtle thing, like your body, your mind, just your sense of presence, rather than just simply observing this, right? Because this kind of observation, stillness, can even help, like how you walk and kind of align you. There's all these sort of things like the Alexander technique and these things. All these things really boil down to contemplative stillness. If you learn that, then you're learning proper posture. By me being still enough, I can sense that just a few seconds ago, I was slightly slouched. And though I sensed it and I naturally, spontaneously just realigned in my physical body and began resting in it. This was procured by a sense of stillness, right? So this sense of sensing from the stillness is observing. But when we are still enough and we turn this introspective observing on itself, we may notice the backdrop of even that's more subtle, that's silence, right? So this can be incorporated into a kind of subtle listening, because then from there we can listen to the body. It's the same kind of sensing, but it's a little bit more subtle, open and relaxed. Stillness still involves a kind of subtle efforting, but when we notice the silence and when we begin sensing from there, it's a bit more relaxed, open, and more subtle, right? All of this can be a mode of muhasabah. um, so with this said, those who have taken the course will notice that this is a crash course I'm giving you right now in like the next 10 to 20 minutes on everything I've taught in the practice of presence, or in like Islamic meditation courses. And of course, it takes practice to really get it, because that's the point, to experience it. But this is the perfect context to, like, in the context, or in regards to the four pillars, to do this. So the next is muraqabah. In this, this is a practice which comes from the name of God, Ar-Raqib, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever watchful of us and of all of creation. And so if we maintain this attitude of watchfulness, especially in our hearts, watchfulness first and foremost of God's awareness of us, this immediately begins to transform, how, our own internal posture with ourselves and God. In other words, when we're aware that someone important walks in, we, kind of our posture shifts. We might sit a bit more still or more straight, or we might be more present, or we might have been saying something very silly and we change our attitude, right? That laugh turns into being a bit more serious, kind of usually, right? When someone walks in, your parents or something like that, that there's a shift. My point is, to beyond my corny jokes, my point is that there's a shift, right, in your attitude, in your posturing with yourself. A kind of lackadaisical, or being more laxed and maybe negligent of your presence, you awaken in the shift to being more present. When even someone from the outside enters, even maybe anyone, but especially someone you respect. So even more so, that if we are more subtly watchful, let's go step by step, of the two angels that sit on our shoulders that record the good and the not so good actions that we do. To even be aware by faith of them, that there are two angelic entities that actually are always present with us, their reality may affect a shift, even when you're alone, especially, right? It may. Going further in, right? We can imagine that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if he was present, how we would act, right, in our sacred imagination. Going further with a reality that's actually always present. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states that he gazes upon the hearts. Right? Allah does not see your outer forms, or he does not value you by your outer forms, but rather by your hearts, by the gazing of him. He gazes not upon your outer forms and your outer context, your status, but rather your heart and what you put forth of actions. These are the two things, but heart takes in precedence. So if we become in a meditation practice more watchful of our and feel God's awareness of us, if we become more aware of God's awareness of us, that is muraqabah. That's the practice of muraqabah, which is a central practice of Islamic spirituality. Right? It's also not only a practice, but a state of orientation that the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions when defining what spirituality is or what spiritual excellence is, ihsan, ma al ihsan, what is ihsan when asked? And he says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is to worship God as if you see him, as if you're watchful of him, in other words, as if you're watching him. So in other words, to cultivate, kind of excellent worship, very beautiful spirituality, excellent spirituality, mastering spirituality, is to cultivate a sense of watchfulness, of muraqabah in your worship. So it's a contemplative orientation, and it can also be a spiritual practice, which is a form of meditation. So this is what this is, right? Now, what are the qualities that one tastes or experiences when you're more watchful of God's awareness of you? When you're more aware of God's awareness internally, you can even sit in this, take a few breaths, and just settle into feeling God's awareness of you in your heart. Let's try to do this for a few moments. Bismillah. Feel free if you want to put your hand on your heart, if you're kind of new to this, or if you're not, and you want to put your hand on your heart and just cultivate a sense of God is gazing upon very lovingly your heart. And just with each and every breath, just settle into this awareness, feeling of this awareness, the feeling of God's awareness of you. Bismillah. And if and when you get distracted by anything, just return. Just become aware that that occurred. Don't be hard on yourself, and return to the feeling sense of God being present for you in your heart. Bismillah. Feel free to try this even with your eyes open while you look down, to continue feeling God's awareness of you, of your heart, as your eyes are slightly open. And if need be, you can put your hand back on your heart or your chest as you do that with each and every breath. In breath, simply be present. And out breath, feel Allah's presence. Try to feel Allah's awareness of you with each and every breath. Now, Muhammadan Rasulullah, coming out of this or staying in it, right? Um, can you recall, if I were to ask you to beyond what beautiful things you might have been feeling, um, or if it was relaxing, or no, I had a hard time, to whatever it was, if you can go to the essence of the practice, what contemplative qualities or perhaps pillars of spirituality did you engage with? No one's going to be wrong. Just feel free to go back in there in your imagination. What did you experience? What were the qualities you may have been engaging with in this practice of muraqabah? Stillness. Okay, that's one. Right. You have to be still enough to be present enough and still enough to then perhaps to be aware that God is aware of you. It takes a little stillness to come to this recognition existentially. Right. We can understand that, or we can just kind of mentally say God is aware of me, but it may not take you to the experience of knowing that God is aware of you. This takes quality of stillness. You are engaging, in other words, with this pillar of what I'm calling stillness as, the heart of uzla, the heart of seclusion, contemplative stillness, at the very point of seclusion, right? Any other pillars of qualities?
Vigilance.
Vigilance. So hakada or sahar, this kind of wakefulness. When we become awake, or when we become aware of ourselves, so we're awake. We're spiritually awake, or just let's take away spiritual. We're consciously awake. We're more conscious. We're more consciously present. And when we're present for God's presence, when we're present for God's presence, we are even more subtly consciously aware. Something else occurs. There's a shift there. We can be aware of ourselves and be fully conscious, but when we bring in a sense of God being aware of us, this does something very subtle. There's almost like an opening, a subtle opening or expansiveness, that actually God is aware. There may be a majesty there and awe, or a heba, this kind of awe, but there's also something that is seen as more encompassing in this awareness. If you're one of faith, this occurs. This is a kind of awakening to something more subtle, from a subtle sense of perception. This is a form of yaqadah. This is a form of wakefulness, right? So anything else?
Um, Being open to what actually is the situation.
All right. And I would put this under wakefulness, but this is just to be open. But the quality of openness, where would you put that in the four pillars?
No.
Okay. All right. Okay. Um, okay. So hunger. In what way does that procure openness?
Because there's
And there's no wrong answer, but no pressure. The only one who's going to be wrong is Sidi Haider.
well, like hunger is essentially a waiting. It's a yearning. I'm looking for something.
Yes. All right. So there's an openness there, although there might be like a constriction physically, there's an openness of this need to fulfill that need. There's this kind of yearning, right? This is a mode of openness. You can also say that wakefulness is a kind of openness. So you can say that because when you wake up, like, what do you do physically? You open your eyes. Openness, right? There's something has opened in you that has made you more wakeful. So that also, I mean, just for you, I'd like you to contemplate kind of openness as wakefulness, inshallah. But yes, what you've said is also sound in terms of hunger. So, so isn't that interesting, right? Maybe one more quality that we may have missed. The silence. Yes, yes, right. These almost may seem like the same thing. Guess what? They are. But we're approaching it from various angles, and one is more subtle than the other. When we cultivate a sense of stillness, or we cultivate being still, practice it in meditation, or we're going to get to it in other practices, in other religious practices, we awaken to an inner stillness that is subtle. When we're settled enough in the stillness, we may awaken to, or notice from the perception of the spiritual heart, a silence that is a bit more subtle. right? And being still is one thing. Discovering stillness is more subtle. It's another thing. And then noticing the silence from the stillness is even more subtle, right? And procuring, as in this process of emptiness, is in between all of this, right? One could say. But also it can open to something more subtle, and that is an intimacy with this. This is more subtle, actually. And this is more of a subtle unveiling. I'll put it to the side, but I will say this kind of intimacy of the hunger turning into a yearning for the discourse, the intimacy with God that you're actually experiencing and tasting is a kind of unveiling, is a subtle opening in this subtle sense of silence, of pure silence, of pure listening for God. And then we may come to a place of um, complete or perpetual openness. That's the nature of your spirit. In other words, your spirit being here in you, or your spirit being embodied as a body, is always open and aware and present, even though we're not. That subtle quality of openness is very subtle. It doesn't ever close, even if you do, right? We get angry, or we get upset, or we get caught up in things. We've forgotten our openness. But if we stayed open, or rather, if we stayed as openness, not if we stayed open, if we resumed our posture as openness, we could be angry and all those things and not be those things, actually. If you actually subtly sat in openness, you would just, it would be like the existential, yes to everything that God is going to bring forth, right? This is very, yes.
So you're saying that openness is prior to is vigilance, or is it prior? Is it after vigilance?
It's a mode of vigilance, you could say.
It's a mode of vigilance.
It's a mode of vigilance. It can be, and it's usually it's in in this schema. It is it's among the most subtle, modes of living presence, but which forces you to embody it. So to return to the relative domain, because in your openness are things being integrated, right? So I put openness into the third journey, what I've called, and we'll speak about to returning to the world, because you return to the world how? As an open heart. And in that open heart is how everything begins to be integrated, right? From that space of openness, from that realization, you begin embodying it, right? And in the Islamic context, in the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, inward and outward. Yes.
Is this which pillar would it fall under
The
more
openness,
appropriately?
I would say, wakefulness.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would say. Although there's a mode of openness in all of these, like when you're still, you're open and you're observing, or you're observing, this is like an openness. But this is not like a like a pure wakefulness where where it's not just you're wakeful, you're cultivating being vigilant and wakeful, but rather you are wakefulness. If you are wakefulness, that's like saying you are the openness that has always been present as your experience. When you go to sleep, you are aware that you're asleep, where otherwise you would not know. You're open, even though your body and your eyes are shut or closed, or even your mind. There's something of your spiritual presence as your spirit that is the pure openness that embraces that condition. You didn't go away. You can say you went somewhere else, but that's still not the you I'm talking about. Like, meaning you had like a dream and this and that, but this all happening in this openness of your spirit. And then as you return, there's contractions experientially, and then we're back in the physical realm, and we're here, but we're still that openness. If you recognize that as your real, self, and you take that posture, that position, that stand as that openness, this will procure amazing shifts. But who can maintain that? Because when you're trying to maintain it, that's not what it is, right? It's just always there, right? So it's a constant, ever present pana'ing, of you, because you as the self are a contraction. So it's like taking a razor blade and continuously shaving the top of your head, kind of after Umrah or like Hajj, right? And like the hair beads come up, zip, zip, right? It's just that state of openness is not giving your nafs a chance to contract and to grow. That's the beauty of it. But that's how hard it is, because it's not a vigilant practice. It's a subtle mode of being.
Okay. So what about the Jawar then? What
Um,
stage would that fall
I see I see this like in hunger as it's kind of it's an intermediary. It can be used in multiple, but it can be seen. It has a function. It has the function of emptying. It also has the function of this openness to intimacy,
Right.
because now you've gone from constriction to an expansion,
Right.
right? A spiritual expansion, a physical, mental constriction of hunger to an awakening. So of the heart, right? So this whole process is hunger, and its end is an intimacy, and an uns with God, right? Which totally, completely nourishes you, right? So it flips hunger, transitions it from a physical hunger to a spiritual yearning for an intimacy that we're now being very nourished by, and it's enough, right? So in many ways, when we perform iftar, if you are among those in this chapter of the verifiers, right? When you perform iftar, when you eat, it's like your portal back into this realm, right? But it's a command of God. So you've experienced such intimacy, such absorption in the communion with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with his communications, with his waradat, and just feeling such intimacy with it in that silence, which is not a silence at all. It's an alive kind of presence of God. It's a living presence of God. That what brings you slightly out of it and brings your focus back here is the breaking of the fast. So what was contracted and spiritually annihilated as nafs now is fed, and it begins expanding a little. And now you're back, like you're coming back here, and that's fine, right? But so it's like a cycle, right? And so this is why we experience it as cycles of this contraction and expansion. Hunger is more dynamic, right? And from the point of view of what it actually means, it is a way to gain mastery, over the lower energies, the lower desires connected to the body mind, and which creates a constriction and a weakness, and cuts off the fuel and the energy, or the energy that fuels them, and allows the heart's attention to go into objects in the physical realm, right?
I guess what I'm asking is and I know there's no, like you said, there's no right or wrong answer, but for example, if some is sorry, if stillness is yaqda, and
Stillness is not. I mean, if you want to do that, stillness is.
I mean, sorry, if stillness is uzla,
Right.
and samt is silence, which is
Yeah,
obvious,
yeah.
and 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 jawar, and what else we have?
Hunger and then wakefulness.
Yeah.
Ahar or yaqadha.
Yeah. So what do those other pillars correspond to then?
Okay. So the first pillar, if we just say in my schema right now, like I'm putting isolation first, or seclusion first, that is uzla, that would be stillness. Then, I mean, is this what you're asking to
Right,
go
exactly.
through?
In terms of like, if it is, put these in stages.
Okay, in stages.
Right. So I think first would be like qif. I'm sorry. So first would be like stillness.
Okay, stillness.
Uzla.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you would go into silence.
Yes, you
right?
could say that. Yeah, yes.
Which is some. And then you would go into what? After
Then I mean, in this schema, then we would say hunger.
hunger. And what would that be like in terms of? Is that you would just call it hunger? That's it.
No, I would call it, yearning, or like spiritual yearning for sustained intimacy with the divine.
Mm-hmm.
for sustained, nourishing intimacy with the divine. So it's like this: you're hungering for nourishment. It's now turned on, and now you begin tasting or being nourished by the divine intimacy, and now you're hungry for that because you've tasted it. It's much more appealing. That's the alchemical effect of 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 spiritual hunger, which is really just yearning. It's pure yearning for what fulfills, what actually fulfills. So in this, then one contemplates this samadhaniya, right? The eternality of God's self-subsistence, because it's in that we subsist, actually, and then we recognize it by experience, by direct experience, and so then we understand. Then we somehow, by God's permission, we take that stand as this as kayumiya, or as samadhaniya, as this eternal self-subsistence, right? And this is what we're witnessing, even though our witnessing of it is temporary, right? And this is why the cycle then of the breaking of the fast, we have to conform to both natures. But when we do, we have gained something, which we gain again and again until it's fixed in us, that that we are not our bodies. To wear this pure spiritual presence connected to the divine presence, that is what nourishes our existence. And that very existence is pure love. It's a yearning for that intimacy, again and again. And that is what actually sustains us to beyond our outer selves and the body. This is what's happening. When we experience that enough, we remain awakened spiritually. Now once we've come into that, we now taste more or less the fullness of the reality of the spirit, of the ruh. If you're following me, now we understand like our essential nature. We are now living it. We understand that we're actually, first and foremost, we're nourished not by a cool conception, but by the deep reality of the real reality of the ruh, of the substance of the spirit. We are spirit. And this then allows us to then disengage and engage with the body and the mind and the lower desires. It's in this process that some of the Sufis, people of the path of intellect, or of the khas, the elites, or the spiritual muhaqqiqs, as Nabi called them here, the verifiers, they speak of tajreed. It's really here where one tastes and experiences disentanglement from the body mind as a liberated spirit.
Which level is the third? The
Yes,
level?
yes. Sought the hunger,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm still there, and so it's at the end of that we're actually that we experience that, right? That we can experience that. This is when that possibility is understood. That as our spirit, when we understand that we're just a pure spirit, we become more liberated from the confines, from the bondage of the body mind. It's really here where pure marifa and the wilaya can begin, and sanctity can begin. Because one who has, not by virtue of, one who by virtue of the realization, if you are still in the process of realization and you are succumbed to, or you are still enslaved by your lowered desires, and this is 99.9% of humanity, you are not liberated spiritually. This does not mean to destroy your desires and to cancel them or to walk away from them. It means not to be determined by them. But in this context, as we begin embodying the spirit again, these desires are integrated and seen as blessings of God. So we're no longer in need of them, but we rejoice in the blessings of God, even in the body. There's a contemplation of the sweetness of intimacy with God in all these things, in the nourishment of food. There's a joy in that, as Allah says. There are the two joys for the one who fasts. The breaking of the fast is a joy for the body, and the meeting with one's Lord. For the muhakkik, these two joys are one joy. They become one. There's no farq in that. But for the one who is still who's on the path and is not a muhakkik, is not a verifier, has not spiritually realized this matter, they are two separate joys, but they're in fact contained in their one joy. They're united joys. And this, when that is witnessed, this is the return of the spirit into embodiment, but as a liberated spirit, embodied. And what procures this process is wakefulness. Is the wakefulness that's not, as I kind of joked earlier a couple nights ago, this kind of constant mindfulness and wakeful, like you're going to fall asleep. But if you're going to go insane or something, right? Just trying to keep your eyes open the whole time. I'm walking around. I'm wakeful, right? You're not wakeful from here, right? You can be wakeful and be asleep. You shouldn't really try to practice it. It can happen, but you will be wakeful even in sleep, but not in the way you think, right? And it's not like a goal. It's just, simply from this awareness that you are actually not, your body's resting. It's like right now you're wakeful and your eyes are shut, right? So you're not stopping, or, I'm not shutting. I'm awake. I'm wakeful. In the same way, by analogy, not in the exact same, when you rest, the mind that is active and the body recedes or turns inward. There's an awareness of that state by your presence, by your spiritual presence, because you are connected with and are your spiritual presence more and more. And this is a modality of wakefulness, but the point of wakefulness is this openness that begins integrating everything in your life into this realization. This occurs, this is why it's the fourth. This is it's, in terms of a station, it's the third journey, right? Coming back out into the world after the seclusion of the heart, right? And its realization, its wakefulness, and into everything in and by that, open heart, that open, wakeful realization. Yes, Edie?
So regarding the Jawar,
Mhm.
how often should one be feeling hunger throughout the day,
Kind of,
every day?
you mean in your day to day?
Yeah, I mean, because for the impression I'm getting is that in order for this third, like if you're in this third stage,
Mhm.
what you're calling Jawar, inshallah, then I mean not you, like we.
Sure. Yes. Yes. I understand.
So then it would appear that one has to be in a feeling hunger
Mhm.
for this to actually have an effect, necessarily so.
Mhm.
And so one should be in feeling some hunger pang
Mhm.
quite often, actually.
Mhm.
Is that right?
If the reality of hunger is interiorized, you don't have to feel as often as you may think or would want to. But again, I want to step back a bit and say that it's not about just experiencing these pillars as stages. You can experience hunger on the first, as pure outwardness, just as we're trying to struggle to be still. All right, just as we're trying to struggle to be awake enough to feel and be present to God's presence in the muraqabah, or in the dhikrullah, which I will come to, inshallah soon. So it's not just, that's one way to conceive of the pillars, that they're stages of realization. Yes, they are. But my point in all of this, to come back to this point, is that, and I'll be happy to discuss this more kind of outside, my point is that in spiritual retreat, you're tasting all of these, you're practicing all of these. So you may be more internalized or realized in one of them, or you're tasting one more, but you're actually participating in all of them in spiritual retreat. That is the big point. That's the big take home, right? And in this, and the more you return to the retreat, or you practice the insights you gained, you may be able to stay in the internal reality of the pillar, right? Again, these aren't the goals for themselves, but once that is tasted, and by the grace of God you begin abiding in it, then the things that you did to get there you don't have to continue to do, like excessive hunger, changing your diet so much, fasting every day, to whatever it is. You don't have to do this outside of Ramadan per se. But the attitude has been fixed in the soul and it's tasting, and this is what you go with, right? So it's not like that per se. And again, as Ibn Arabi alludes to, the verifiers, they're not trying to be hungry or satiated kind of anymore. So once this occurs, you don't have to do those things in that way, but they will occur because one's state for the muhakkik, for the verifier, who has gone beyond the veil, for whom the veil has been lifted, the veil of apparent separativity, but real separativity to between the soul and God's presence, right? For them, for the one by whom God has lifted the veil and they're a verifier of this matter, then when they're in a state of jadba, this may manifest on the body as hunger, or meaning lack of food, living without a lack of food, because the jadba, the intimacy of the divine attraction, is overpowers the animal, like the animal energy, or the soul, the nafsani appetite for
Right.
appetite
Right.
for food, right? Or for intercourse, or for anything else. It may overpower that. And so this is a state from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of the awliya have gone, years without sexual intercourse while being married, right? This is a state. This is not a goal. It just happens. It could happen in a state of jadba. They say that, that Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jalani was celibate for most of his life until the age of 50. Until the age of 50, like that's a big deal. And then he was informed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to now marry. And so he engaged in sexual intercourse for the sake of God, and actually his seed spread. He married multiple times, had multiple children, and from that spread his order. These sons and their sons and their daughters and so forth were realizers. So God willed this. He prepared and purified his soul so much that then that by the permission of God, God transmitted the seed of sanctity in his seed, right? But you see, to before that, so he was in a state of jadba and was fasting, was doing these things in his his intimacy. But now his intimacy was expressed by integrating physical intimacy, right? So it's not the same to um, like to behind the veil and in front of the veil.
I guess what I'm asking is,
Mhm.
on a more practical level,
Yeah.
not that what you're saying is not practical, but I mean, like, for people who are not realized,
Yes,
like myself, how can we, I mean, so we should not look at these as stages, is what you're saying.
Yes. Because I think this is a mistake. This is where you're going to fall into problems, as someone who's trying to cultivate or practice this. Hunger has a spiritual function. It causes constriction of the nafsani tendencies. So as a mode of the mujahada of the self, and to contain the energies, or to navigate them, or to redirect them, or to make them weaker so we can work on ourselves more, it's essential for the mujahada on the nafs, especially for the lower desires. We need to do a muhasabah. If we're severely dominated by our lower desires, as most human beings are nowadays, especially with amplifying purposes and functions of these machines and screens, right? What took a lot of effort to do as a sin is now in your home, right? Just for all intents and purposes, like with the impulse of a click of a button and just looking, right? This might have taken in the 80s a little bit of time, staying up all night, subculture nonsense, everyone's asleep, and then you're doing weird things. Now it's all at your home, like just pressing a button and just kind of viewing these things, right? That impulse and what happens to the sins of the eyes, like the desire for this, you get stuck in it. But if you begin fasting, it can help take away. For example, I'm giving inshallah an extreme example for all of you. It does not inshallah bi'idhnillah apply, right? But fasting helps to curb that appetite. So it's a mode of the mujahada of the nafs, right? So in as much as this is needed, one should practice it and understand it also with this intention, but the primary intention of following the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which then takes it out of accomplishing mode. We're just following. We're simply following in love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there is some working and mujahada and struggle, but hunger has this spiritual function, right? And so this is why some will let a little bit, may for certain years of their life fast a lot and then stop fasting and then fast again. There could be cycles, right? So it's not cut and dry, even on the practical level of not being realized, right? It's not. Sometimes we may need it. Sometimes the erotic energy, for example, that's the one thing. It comes and goes. It gets stronger, and there's like waves of it. And when it comes, it's a mode of knowledge of self, right? Maybe I need to fast a little bit more for this reason, and that's on that level. Or maybe I enjoy the intimacy of the divine, even as someone who's not realized. And that's now why I'm fasting, because I feel more stabilized. I feel more even keel. I feel the scattering mind is much less, let alone those sins or excessive eating or whatever it is. I feel that scatteredness is much less. I feel more at home in peace while fasting. This is like a kind of uns. This is a kind of intimacy with oneself, with one's spiritual self and God. Right. So you see how there's not
Yeah, I see what you mean.
yeah.
So I guess what you're saying is that on the level of the practice itself, like the arkan, the four pillars themselves, it wouldn't be, you're not suggesting they should be stages per
Yes,
se, but
they
the
don't
qualities,
necessarily have to be, but they can be seen or realized as stages.
right?
But
the qualities that
yes,
point to are,
yes,
and in
yes,
their realization
yes,
can happen in stages.
yes, and yes, and so that can happen. But for all intents and purposes, we're practicing all of these pillars
Right.
in the retreat. And we may be engaging with one from a particular place and another from some other place of deepened interiority. And that's just important for us to take kind of an account of. This is so in terms of those practices, I wanted to outline as exercises for you. So in the interest of time, the next would be, and I may have to pick up on this the next time, although I wanted to end this and move to another topic, but this may be important enough to continue to speak about. So my apologies, but I hope also the questions are helpful, and they have been helpful. I hope for even those online to clarify what we're speaking of, and I hope it's making sense that like how we're using these practices or these examples to show that you're reinforcing the experiencing of a quality of each and every one of these pillars in some way. So the point that what the take home is that if you're here enough, long enough, then when you're in your prayer, your ritual prayer, there are moments of stillness. This recognition or awareness may deepen your presence in the prayer. Sitting after the prayer and doing your tasbih in silence may accentuate the sense of the silence, which then becomes a contemplative support for presence in your dhikr. Right? Being in a state of fasting allows an emptying and a purging and a purifying of negative emotions or toxic emotions so that the heart has more space to be more freed up for intimacy with God, which is happening as you fast. And practicing, combining that with the practice of silence and other modes of worship in the day when you're fasting. Do you see? And which may procure a more wakefulness, being more present. Even though your body's tired, something in you is more present, more feeling more light, more pristine, more clear. Well, you see how all the like the pillars are working to promote your presence of heart and self with God. That's the point. So the more you stay in the retreat, the more you engage naturally with these qualities, not necessarily stages of the pillars, but these contemplative qualities. That they may again be experienced as stages, as deepenings, one more subtle than the other, but they're all working in tandem simultaneously, as well. And that's the real take home. The next two are fikr and dhikr. And I think I'll save this for tomorrow, inshallah. I want to say a little bit more about fikr. And it's an hour and a half now. I've been speaking for about an hour. I came in about a half hour late, and I appreciate that Sayyidi Haidar was helping us all out with the guided meditation. But I do want to say a few more words. I want to spend some time on fikr and dhikr. So I feel that I will not give this its proper to if I attempt it now because of the fatigue of the body. So I don't think I'll be able to. So inshallah for tomorrow. But I want to, because I brought it up, very briefly, I'll just say that fikr is contemplation. So it's both contemplation of focusing on contemplating deeply sacred meanings of the Quran and of 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 sacred ideas that you may be contemplating on the level of the intellect and mind. This is a mode of contemplation of fikr that, obviously, if we ask ourselves among the qualities of the pillars, what do we have to be in a state of to be contemplating better or more deeply or more holistically? Stillness. Is there any other one? There's two of them that are huge in this. Stillness is one of them. Silence, excellent. If you are engaged in stillness and especially silence, and you fill the silence of the heart with a sacred idea and you become absorbed in it, this increases your knowledge of the reality or of the meaning of the thing you're contemplating. You've become so present for whatever you're assimilating of doctrinal knowledge, spiritual knowledge, esoteric knowledge, exoteric knowledge, outward knowledge of the sacred law, inward knowledge of the spiritual way, or knowledge, subtle knowledges of the ma'arif or of metaphysics, to whatever you want to call it. If you are not in a more of a state of silence, your assimilation of those ideas into the intellect, the soul, and the sacred imagination will not occur optimally. One would have to procure the space for the spaciousness of silence to be able to hold a thought and allow the transformation of that meaning into your reality. This is really how it works, how some are able to assimilate knowledge. They don't realize it, but there's a sense of stillness in them and they may have a prerequisite of a talent that allows them to, but to really deepen and integrate that knowledge, it takes also silence. So this is the quality that one would be engaging with as you're reading a book in silence here in the Zawiya, and the Itikaf or something, some kind of spiritual book, or to reviewing even on the level of fiqh, some injunctions for the sacred law. In silence, it's helpful. Silence and stillness would be the qualities. One could add hunger. Although one is tired, there's also a sense of focus that comes with hunger. You'll be surprised at what you can digest of the meanings when you're not digesting physical food. That intellectual knowledge becomes a nourishment in these states of hunger, right? And anyone who is an intellectual or has an intellective soul type, they hunger and thirst for knowledge. They're actually addicted to knowledge. That's a beautiful, like matter, right? At some point it may become a veil, but it's a beautiful matter of assimilating subtleties and subtle understandings into one's being. And so that's a kind of hunger for it. So you see how this is a support, right? Finally, for the dhikrullah, so much can be said about this. Inshallah, I'll begin with these two. I want to say a little bit more about this, because when we deepen into contemplation, also for the fikr, coming back, it's not just cognitive, It's also cardiac. It's also heart. There's a subtle heart perception in assimilating doctrines or esoteric subtle understandings. Like when I say, for example, um, lifting the veil, if you're more present and aware and silent and open from the heart, you may receive intuitions of what that could be, rather than an interesting concept that mystics, speak about, and I'm going to file that into important, right? We've all done that. But if you're aware and available, and someone says the lifting of the veil, and you're in your spiritual heart, and your heart is listening to those words and seeing the light of their meanings, something may occur in the spiritual imagination that, yes, I understand. I can see this meaning. It is God actually lifts that veil, and then there's a perception that occurs of the reality. This is then experientially realized as a meaning because we're more present, more silent, more open, all of these things from the contemplative quality. So there's an engagement, in other words, with an awakened heart due to spiritual retreat that allows the direct assimilation or the direct witnessing of the meanings of what one is reading or reflecting upon, right? And fikr can also be a mode of self-contemplation, which comes back to the muhasabah, right? And also one can be in stillness contemplating nature, right? There's the sound of nature, but it's also a very beautiful silence, right? So these are the inward and outward signs, and especially when reciting Quran, diving into the meanings means that you've dived into yourself, and your soul has already been opened. You're in your heart and in a state of contemplation. And then one can dive into certain meanings that you would otherwise not picked up as indications or pointers, as isharat. These are the subtle intuitions, intuitive understandings that come from the heart. But we're hardly in the heart to be able to receive those intuitive understandings, right? So this is the importance of seeing and appreciating that that these pillars of spirituality, spiritual knowledge, are what procure proper assimilation and integration of even sacred ideas or insights that are very subtle, that are not meant for everyone. Like even lifting the veil, that's not meant for everyone. But if you understand that, or you have an insight that opens something in you, sometimes there's like an opening insight. That's a mystical insight. Although you could say that the normative to believer has to have faith in the fact that the veil is lifted when they die. Now, as a mystic or as an inner seeker, you may have an intuition that, yes, precisely because death is an opening, is the return of the spirit, or the spirit coming out of the body. So the body was kind of confining of the spirit, and now the veil, which is the body and the mind, have been lifted, and now there's perceiving, there's direct perception of unseen realities. Wow. So the veil has been lifted, but can I cultivate an experience where the veil is in some way kind of lifted, that I can die before I die? You see? Right. This is only possible for the mystic who has been the one with the mystic tendency, who has been able to sit in this long enough. For the dhikrullah, I will stop here, and more should be said about the dhikrullah, but one can argue, and I will demonstrate how it relates to every pillar, right? But obviously, wakefulness it's when you remember Allah, you become mindful and awakeful, or wakeful to God's presence, to God's remembrance. But actually, every one of the pillars has some profound relation to the dhikrullah. So we'll talk about that, inshallah, tomorrow. And as a passing note, now that I will get back into, um, there are ways to, like, with these practices of presence, you can find them and engage with them with multiple religious practices that you participate in the itikaf. For example, when you perform the ablution of the wudu, right? If you are still enough, something special happens. There's a sensing of the body. There's even a sensing of a release, a catharsis, a falling away of sins, and so forth. Listening to the adhan, sense of silence and sacred listening. Quran recitation is a form of the dhikrullah that if you're still enough, it's silent enough, it will help you. But my hope for the take home for you all is that that in here, be consciously aware that if you feel a heightened sense of intuition, that take a look. What am I? How can I use a pillar as a support of contemplation to enhance my sincerity in worship, to enhance my transparency to before God, right? When we standing for prayer. And then I'm going to get to all these practices, especially prayer, to which integrates all of these. It's a comprehensive practice. So inshallah, I can't wait to do that, but I think it's better to stop here for you and for me, inshallah. And we'll get into this, but all these practices, the morning prayers, when we are in the day, we are not reciting aloud, like in the rakats, Quran. We're doing it silently in silence. This will be enhanced for you, and this can be a support to remaining in presence, in your human presence, in the divine presence, and to be in the prophetic presence. Everything will follows this. So the silence in the day, the Dhuhr and the Asr prayer, the speech at night in the prayer, how this affects our listening, how it affects our wakefulness, right, etc.